Modern militaries spend years crafting leaders. There are academies, endless hours of professional development, and advanced war colleges, but one of history's most impactful leaders never spent a minute in the classroom. And despite that, soldiers followed her into battle, not once but repeatedly. When she appeared, morale surged, assaults resumed, and fortresses fell, even ones that trained commanders thought were impregnable. This leader was Joan of Arc, a young peasant girl who inspired soldiers to succeed where experienced knights had failed. And in this series, we're not just telling Joan's story. We're analyzing one of the best examples of inspirational leadership in military history. We'll also discuss how military professionalism, despite its many strengths, sometimes blinds itself to outliers like her. And in a final bonus video, we'll examine my own theory on Joan of Arc, one that will probably be pretty controversial. But unfortunately, before we get to any of that, we have to clear up some of the misconceptions. Like most famous commanders, Joan's story is shrouded in a lot of myths, as well as modernists attempting to imprint their social ideologies onto her life. So before we dive into the military side of Joan, we need to first start by analyzing and rejecting these myths and theories. And many of these go back to her earliest days, even before she was born. So to start, we need to go back before the sieges and the battles. We need to start with a little girl in a worn red dress. Most people know that Joan was born in the village of Domrémy in Lorraine, a borderland region caught in the struggle between the Dauphin and the Duke of Burgundy. In fact, the village of Domrémy was a small loyalist holdout surrounded by areas loyal to the Burgundians, a fact that would have a large impact on Joan's life. But we'll get to that in a bit. First, we need to address 3 common misconceptions that can color our view of Joan of Arc. First, it's often said that Joan was a poor peasant girl. That's only half true. Yes, her family were peasants, but they were actually quite well off considering their social class. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a village doyen, or a leader who oversaw taxes, helped settle disputes, and organized local defenses. According to testimony from Joan's rehabilitation trial, the family owned the only stone house in the village, as well as livestock, a plow team, and a few dozen acres of land. The family even had its own coat of arms. So, peasants, yes. Poor, not exactly. The second myth is that Joan was a shepherdess. The evidence doesn't support that, and while she did help with animals, that was just part of her chores, not a profession. The term shepherdess was often used by nobles as a romanticized catch-all for any peasant girl. Critically, in her condemnation trial, Joan said, quote, "As for my occupation, I helped my mother in the house and did the spinning and other such things." This makes sense. Remember that she left home around the age of 16, which was too young to have had a formal vocation. Her role in the family was domestic, which was pretty standard for young girls of the period. The third myth is the most controversial, and it states that Joan was really the illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Orleans and the Queen of France, Isabeau of Bavaria. This theory, while certainly exciting, crumbles under scrutiny. First, the Queen gave birth on the 10th of November 1407, and the Duke of Orleans was murdered on the 23rd of the same month. While possible, it's hard to believe that they were able to conceive a child in these short 13 days. And even if they were able to, then Joan would have been born in 1408, making her around 23 years old at the time of her 1431 condemnation trial. While it's conceivable that Joan was incredibly confused about her own age, it's hard to believe that she'd be off by 4 years. The other thing that this theory centers around is Joan's coat of arms. Proponents state that the heraldic sword symbolized illegitimacy, but to believe this, we'd have to accept that this is the only case I can find where the sword parti per palais was given this symbolism. It also makes no sense that baby Joan would have been sent to live with a random peasant family in Domrémy. Remember, this village was in the borderlands, surrounded by areas controlled by the Duke of Burgundy. The same Duke of Burgundy that ordered the assassination of the Duke of Orleans. So there's no good reason for Joan to be sent there. If the plan was to protect Joan but raise her quietly, she would have been sent to somewhere near Chinon or Orleans itself. If they wanted to get rid of her, then they would have just done so at birth. So I think we could dispense with this theory. While it certainly satisfies a modern urge for romantic intrigue and conspiracy, there's no hard evidence for it, and the foundations of the theory are illogical at best. And once we strip away the myths and romanticism, we're left with a well-off peasant girl. Some people might even say that she was unremarkable, but as we'll see, that wasn't true either. In fact, the records of her rehabilitation trial show that Joan was remarkable in a few ways. First, she was noted for being unusually religious in a time period where religion was the norm. Records state as a child she'd fall to her knees when the church bells rang, and also noted that she attended Mass daily. Her mother would testify that she often prayed fervently for the poor and for those in distress, and Oviette, likely her closest childhood friend, stated that Joan would often leave their games to pray alone to God. She also was said to prefer work to play. It must be noted that all this testimony comes from Joan's rehabilitation trial. Here, the French did stand to benefit from nullifying the English charges against Joan and thereby validating the French king's right to rule. But these accounts are also indirectly supported by her condemnation trial, where the investigators also questioned people from her home. One investigator stated that he, quote, found nothing about her that I wouldn't wish to hear about my own daughter. So these accounts of her virtuous childhood are likely accurate. However, it's also not the childhood that we think of when we consider the great field commanders of the Middle Ages. Figures like William Marshall, Boucicaut, and the Black Prince were all noted to train with weapons from an early age, and no record indicates that Joan had any such training, and such an education would have been highly abnormal for a girl in the Middle Ages, especially a peasant girl. However, a lack of training didn't protect her from war. One of her first experiences of war came in 1425 when the robber captain Henry of Orly attacked her village. This was not a sustained raid, but it was fast and terrifying, so much so that the villagers had no time to flee with their valuables. Orly's men made off with cattle and household goods, though these were later recovered and returned by Anthony of Valdemont, a local lord. But did Joan learn anything from this that she would use later? Did this brief experience of war give her any insights? And likely not, since she would have been about 14 years old. Her memory was likely one of confusion and fear as terrified villagers came running to her father, who, as Doyen, was responsible for the village's security. Perhaps her father left abruptly either to urge villagers to safety or try to rally a defense. Either way, Joan was likely not directly involved in the raid itself. However, even these limited experiences would have been traumatic for a girl of her age. It's probably no surprise that shortly after this she had her first vision of Michael the Archangel, and for the next 3 years Joan kept having these visions. In addition to the Archangel, there were 2 other saints. Saint Catherine likely referred to Catherine of Alexandria, a saint commonly associated with purity and virginity, and Saint Margaret of Antioch also represented such purity and would have been familiar to Joan as her statue was in the church at Domrémy. And these voices probably played a major role in Joan's refusal to get married, even going so far as to go to court to refuse a betrothal. This is an important event in Joan's life that is often incorrectly cast as either youthful or feminist defiance. In fact, it was an act of religious obedience. Both St. Catherine and St. Margaret had refused marriage proposals on the basis they were already pledged to God. This was a key factor in their purity. If Joan was inspired by these saints, she likely also believed that God did not intend for her to marry. Thus, her refusal was not defying a quote-unquote woman's role. Instead, it was driven by her desire to fill a very female role from early Christianity, that of the woman who was pure because of her absolute dedication to God over marriage. She was not defying her father, Jacques d'Arc, she was obeying her ultimate father, God. And over time, the voices gave her another instruction. They ordered her to go forth into France and lead the Dauphin to his coronation. Just as she obeyed them in refusing marriage, Joan also was determined to obey these instructions no matter what the risks were. In 1428, with the assistance of her kinsman Durand Laxart, she determined to act. Durand remembered her reciting the prophecy that, quote, France would be destroyed by a woman and saved by a maiden. This is interesting because it shows that, from the start, Joan was very aware of the prophecy that enhanced her credentials. And on May 13th, 1428, she was seen walking the battlements of Vaucouleurs in her worn red dress. She was asking everyone she met where Sir Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of the fort, was and when he would be willing to receive her. Perhaps surprisingly, Bertrand de Poulager, one of her future escorts and supporters, remembers the captain of Vaucouleurs meeting with her. He recalls Joan informing the captain that she would lead the Dauphin to be crowned king. Understandably, this provoked laughter and jeers from some of the onlookers. Sir Robert promptly sent her home, telling her kinsman to give her a couple of slaps to cure her impertinence. Some judge Sir Robert harshly for this, but let's consider the overall absurdity. Imagine you're commanding a far-flung outpost surrounded by enemies with no hope of relief if you get attacked. Suddenly, a young farm girl appears at your main gate, telling you that you need to send a detachment of soldiers to escort her to the commanding general halfway across the country so she can tell him how to win the war. I think most of us would have dismissed her out of hand. In fact, concerns about his vulnerable position were well justified. Later that year, an English and Burgundian army of around 2,500 men descended on the area, burning nearby villages and besieging Vaucouleurs itself. Joan was also impacted by this campaign as her family was forced to flee to Neufchâteau, the nearest fortified city. From the walls, she may have been able to see the smoke that rose from her village as it was burned by the invaders, another traumatic experience for her teenage years. But if anything, the trauma only strengthened Joan's conviction. In fact, this is a hallmark of inspirational leaders. Setbacks, struggles, and hardships often only galvanize and reinforce their conviction. Similar inspirational commanders such as George Washington and Simon Bolivar exhibited the same resilience in the face of setbacks and defeats. And so, just as Washington returned to the battlefield after the harrowing winter at Valley Forge, so too did Joan return to Vaucouleurs. The peasant girl in her red dress continued to tell the locals about her mission, and by February of 1429, she had been sufficiently persistent to gain another audience with Sir Robert, who promptly threw her out again. However, by this time, Joan's insistent preaching had started to win her both fame and followers. Two of these followers, a local wheelwright and his wife, gave Joan lodgings within Vaucouleurs. More importantly, she had started to gain followers not just amongst the commoners, but also amongst the nobility. One such follower was Jeanne de Metz, who at that time was a squire in Robert de Baudricourt's household. Jeanne de Metz remembered her worn red dress in his testimony, where he recalls her explaining her mission to him. He vowed to assist her, and this is notable because it occurred just before she went to visit a far more important noble. This noble was Duke Charles II of Lorraine. Struck down by an illness, he had heard tales of this girl who claimed to have been sent by God. Sometime in early 1429, he sent a messenger providing her with a safe conduct to visit him. Critically, it's at this point that she first started to wear men's clothing. Jeanne de Metz remembers asking her if she believed she could, quote, make this journey dressed as she was, to which Joan stated she would be willing to take a man's attire. De Metz fetched some clothes that belonged to one of his men, and it seems that the people of Vaucouleurs also gave her a set of men's clothing. It's important to discuss this aspect of Joan because it's often been misinterpreted both by contemporaries and by modernists, each with the goal of pushing their own agenda. Joan's decision to wear men's clothing has nothing to do with rebelliousness or gender identity. From her own statements and from historical analysis of men's attire, this was, without a doubt, a safety measure for her. She was clearly aware, likely through the horror stories told by peasants of the time, of the violence that soldiers could visit on women. For a young girl whose identity revolved around purity and virginity, this was arguably a greater threat than death. Men's clothing at the time was designed with ties to secure the hose to the tunic. For a man, this served the same purpose as a belt. For a young girl, it was added security since it would make it much more difficult for someone to attack her. Thus, this decision was about a young girl who was very aware of the dangers that she faced and took what she considered to be sensible measures to protect herself. And so, attired in men's clothing, Joan duly went to meet the Duke of Lorraine. From her own testimony, the Duke asked her about his health, to which she replied that she didn't know a cure. She also admonished him for his infidelity and the fact that he had sired at least 5 illegitimate children with one of his serving girls. This was a story she had undoubtedly heard in Neufchâteau, which had filed a suit against the Duke. Joan also says that she requested that the Duke, quote, give me his son and some men-at-arms, and in return I would pray for his health. There's no record of the Duke giving her the requested men, and Joan seems to have turned the return journey to Vaucouleurs into a pilgrimage. And when she returned to Vaucouleurs, she received good news. Sir Robert had changed his mind and was willing to send her to the Dauphin. But what caused Sir Robert to have this change of heart? Let me know what you think in the comments section below. In my eyes, there were probably multiple factors. First of all, Sir Robert was likely worn down by war. While he had negotiated his way out of the English Burgundian siege by agreeing not to attack the Duke of Burgundy, he had to know that Vaucouleurs was isolated and wouldn't stand free for long. In addition, it appears that Joan had acquired a following that, if not large, was quite enthusiastic and also contained members of his own household, such as Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy. The captain likely knew that populist figures can quickly turn into a headache for local authorities. It may be that he was eager to make said potential headache into someone else's problem. Lastly, the summons from the Duke of Lorraine almost certainly gave Joan a certain level of credibility. It's one thing for a bunch of peasants to call someone divinely inspired, it's another when a duke issues an official invitation. It is clear that Sir Robert was not fully convinced of Joan's credentials. Before she left, he visited her with the parish priest, Jean Fournier, and had the priest perform an exorcism. This was likely hedging his bets in case Joan was later found to be a witch. Nonetheless, Joan was now on her way. Her party was small, likely to allow them to move stealthily and avoid detection by the English or Burgundians who controlled most of the major roadways. It consisted of Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, both squires in Sir Robert's household, along with a servant for each of them. However, possibly the most important member of the party, other than Joan herself, was the royal messenger Colette de Vienne. As a royal messenger, he would have been very familiar with the roads between Vaucouleurs and Chinon. More importantly, he would have been well versed in heraldry and therefore able to quickly recognize enemy soldiers at a distance. But neither the small size of her following nor the dangers of the road ahead mattered to Joan. She was finally on her way to fulfill what she clearly believed was her life's mission. And in our next video, we'll examine Joan's actions in the field. How did she succeed at Orléans, where so many trained commanders had failed? And can inspirational leadership be more effective than experience and training? Those are questions that we're going to examine in our next episode, and until then, I hope you take care and I appreciate you stopping by to watch.